Hi, I'm Dr. Schroyer, and welcome to part 2 of homeostasis. Today we're going to talk about some biological aspects of homeostasis. We will cover the characteristics of a living organism, the order of structure in the organism. We will talk about water content and some compartments of the water content. And we will speak a little bit more on ICF and ECF and some of the feedback control mechanisms and the nutrient pathway. So let's get started. Alright, so we know human beings are alive. So what constitutes properties of life? Life properties. 1. Growth. The ability to grow and mature. 2. Metabolism. The ability to use energy to do things, perform work, and to create structure. Motion. The ability to move. Reproduce. To reproduce another person and respond. This aspect of response, stimuli and response and adjustment is what we're going to be homing in on. Now, the order of structure goes from the smallest to the most complex. So starting at the beginning, we're talking about the cell, which is the basic unit of life. It has most of the characteristics and properties of a living thing, except reproduction. Reproduction is in the complex animal, in the gametes. But a cell does not produce that. So reproduction doesn't apply to the cell, but it can grow and divide through mitosis. Okay, so cell. The next order of complexity is the tissue. Tissue is a lot of cells of the same type, such as epithelial tissue. This creates the lining of most of the any organs, and any kind of organ systems have linings. They're made by epithelial tissue, but there's many types of tissue. There's epithelial, muscle, nervous, connective. Next up is the organ. Organs are made of different types of tissue. So, like for instance, the cardiac muscle is made of muscle, nerve, and connective tissue. Then you have organ systems, like the cardiovascular system, which is made up of the heart and the arteries, the veins, and the capillary beds. Then you have the organism. This is the whole person, or the whole organism. This has the reproductive capability that's mentioned in the properties of life. Because the organism can create gametes, which are basically sex cells. They're not normal, regular cells. So, from order of structure, you have cell, then tissue, organ systems, and then the entire organism. These all play a part in normalcy and in the homeostasis process in the organism. So let's talk about the water content. So water, total body water, is made up of the ICF, which is the intracellular and the extracellular fluid. ICF is about 60% of the total body water. Obviously, when you want to use a decimal, you divide 60% by 100 and you get, your decimal. Okay. The ECF, the extracellular, makes up the vascular space and the special areas like CSF fluid or joint fluid. The vascular space is inside the vessel. So if we draw this out, we have a cell, and in the cell you have the ICF. Outside the cell you have a vessel, and you have the interstitial space. It's called the interstitial space. This is the vascular space. Okay. So between the cell, intracellular fluid, you have the interstitial space, and then you have the vascular space. This connotates the extracellular fluid, plus I said there's special areas such as cerebral spinal fluid. Now, obviously the ICF is greater than the ECF. The ECF is 40% and the ICF is 60%. So let's talk a little bit more about when it comes to sodium and potassium. This is the cell membrane. Inside the cell, this is the ICF, and this is the ECF. Inside you have potassium, outside you have sodium. Okay? The potassium atom is much larger than the sodium, and you can find that out by looking at the periodic table. Outside is the sodium. Now, these are where you would find the most and highest concentrations of these two ions. And I want you to pay attention, but you notice that the charge is the same. It's a +1 formal charge. And water is found in both compartments, both areas. Okay. Now, an interesting point is through cell evolution, the sodium was kept outside because this signifies salt water, or the salt of the sea, the sodium chloride. And through evolution, and because the potassium was larger, the cell was able to take potassium and keep it on the inside, maintaining the same charge across the membrane of the cell, and trapping potassium on the inside of the cell. And so this sets up kind of a differential, of which I will explain in the further lectures to come. Okay, so if we speak about the nutrient pathway, this is merely a discussion or concept of when you ingest sodium, when you load sodium or you ingest anything, it has to go through a certain pathway. And so the first step is, for instance, I'm thirsty, I want to take a glass of sodium drink. You have to drink it, so you have to swallow it, then you have to digest it, then you have to absorb it. So the first step would be ingestion. You have to be able to ingest the nutrient. The second is the transportation. So once it's absorbed through the digestive system, it has to be transported by the vascular or cardiovascular system to the place of where it's going to be utilized. And then 3, the concentration at that site has to be regulated. So there's a concentration regulation, and as we will see in further lectures, you're going to see that it has to do with the process of osmosis and the antidiuretic hormone. I'll talk more about these things in more detail in further lectures. And last but not least is the controls. The controls to control the concentration of these compounds and these nutrients. So under control we have what we call the feedback. It is a feedback mechanism. And what feedback mechanism means is that you have a situation let's say a high sodium, and through the feedback mechanism it returns the sodium to a lower state. So the high sodium can be an abnormal high state. It'll return the sodium to a low state. Now there's three feedback controls. One is the negative feedback, which is what this is. You have an abnormality, it senses, and it sends back and adjusts in a negative way. High sodium ends up being low. You have a positive feedback, like uterine contractions during the delivery, where you get a contraction, you're trying to deliver the baby, and you get an increased contraction, and you're still trying to deliver the baby. So you get a contraction, and then you get a higher contraction, so you get more contraction. That's called positive feedback. Then the last is called adaptive. Adaptive, I like to think of it as a small increment rise in negative feedback. It's going to adjust, but it's going to do it in very, very small steps. Okay, so in summary, living systems have these properties and characteristics. We're mainly interested in response and stimuli in this topic of sport hydration. The order of structure is everything, and from cell to the person. The cell, the tissue, the organs, and the organ systems are basically at the subconscious level, including the central core brain centers, or old brain centers, which operate on automatic. It's not a conscious effort. Conscious is at the cerebral cortex, okay, which is part of the brain also. You have water content. Total body water is made up of these two main compartments. Most of it's intracellular, and we're going to home in on the vascular system because of the smallness of it, and because it can be measured readily, and it's the most sensed, and it's the smallest amount, observing the conservation of matter and energy. You have your ECF and ICF differences between the sodium and potassium, and you have water between, water in both compartments. You have the nutrient pathway on what it would take to drink a gallon of Gatorade, and you have the control feedback mechanism. These are the control systems, and they work by feedback. You have negative, positive, and adaptive, which is incremental negative feedback. So we'll see you next time for part 3. We'll discuss density, and diffusion, and we will discuss gradient and other topics. This will be more of physics and mathematics, so I hope you wear your thinking cap on the next one. It's Dr. Schwartz. See you next time.